Are you doing all the right things? Like you're lifting the heavy weights and you're eating well, getting your protein in, taking your supplements, and you're even taking hormones. And yet you're still not seeing improvements in your bone health. Like your DEXA scores are still not optimal. And have you ever wondered if that hamster wheel that you're on, all that stress and that poor sleep, and how that could be affecting your bones? Well, if that sounds like you, then this episode is for you. Now, this is episode 5. It's the final episode of our bone health series. Now, there's a lot of things that go into bone, but I just covered 5 of them. In episode 1, we covered the screening process, how you interpret your scans and how to understand what it means without panic, and why bone scans are information and it's not a verdict and it's not everything. Okay. It's a really important episode. I'm going to have a link to these episodes in the show notes. And I really, if you haven't heard that one, it's the foundation of all of these episodes. And I go really into detail of what happens to our bone health in menopause. So please go back and look at that episode. Episode 2, it was all about movement, how bones respond to load, resistance, impact exercises, and why walking alone is probably not enough to build bones. And in episode 3, we covered nutrition and food and the importance of getting protein in and getting all the minerals and why calcium on its own, which is probably the only thing your doctor may have told you to take, it's not the solution. And we also talked a little bit about gut and how that affects the absorption of all this food and supplements and things that we're trying to get in our body. It's a wonderful episode. It actually, I think that was a pretty long one. And in episode 4, we talked about hormones. This is the last one that we did just before this one. And we talked about hormone therapy and how estrogen is bone protective and where hormone therapy kind of fits into your whole bone building strategy. And today we're going to talk about a piece that many women overlook, and that's recovery. Because bone isn't just built in the gym and in the kitchen, it's built during recovery. And this is why we're focusing on sleep and stress this time. So let's just do a little recap on how bone modeling actually works. And I want you to learn these 2 words if you haven't learned them already. So bone is an amazing tissue. Actually, it's constantly being broken down and building up. And it's this whole network of nerves, and it's incredible. It's not just like you build a bone and it's static and that's it. We have this thing called, or this process called bone remodeling. And the 2 words that I want you to remember is osteoclasts and osteoblasts. Now, osteoclasts is when bones break down, and it's got that k, right? The other one has a b sound, and the k sound reminds me of cutting. So that's how I remember. Okay, osteoclasts, cutting down bone. And then we have osteoblasts, b, and that's building new bone. And this whole process is really tightly regulated by your hormones, right? Including your estrogen, which you probably know by now, and cortisol. This is your stress hormone, and your growth hormones. And bone building itself, it just doesn't happen during stress. It happens during recovery. So this is why some of the things that you're doing all the right things, but you're still not having results, then you want to take a look at your sleep and your stress and your recovery, because this is where it could be a real big missing piece. Now, let me first talk about cortisol and stress a little bit and how this affects bone loss, because we have acute stress and we have chronic stress, and we have acute inflammation and chronic inflammation. I'm sure you've heard both of these, but in case you haven't, acute is short term, and a short term stressor, let's say you cut your finger, it's kind of a stress, you get inflammation, a little acute inflammation, and then the finger heals, right? Done. This is a very necessary process. But when we have chronic stress, imagine you are just don't heal and you get some inflammation and it gets out of control. And then you have chronic inflammation and chronic stress. In chronic stress, this increases cortisol, your stress hormone. And cortisol actually is the same thing like inflammation and stress. In small amounts, it's great, and it's necessary. But in chronic elevated levels, not so good. So chronic, that long-term cortisol or stress, it leads to poor recovery. And we get this thing called low-grade inflammation. Low-grade inflammation is almost like you just don't feel it. And a lot of low-grade inflammation can happen in the body as well. You don't know it's there. But it's chronic and it's there. And this is why we can measure these things, which is really cool. And if you don't measure, you don't really know. So when your cortisol is too high for too long, this increases bone breakdown. Okay. Osteoclast activity increases and it decreases the osteoblast activity, that bone formation. It also disrupts your gut microbiome. So how in the world are you going to absorb all these nutrients that you're eating? It reduces calcium absorption. It increases calcium loss. And this has a net bone loss effect on the body. Okay. Because we have the bone building, the bone breakdown. It's a beautiful dance when it's all done right. But when we have too much breakdown, that's when we have low bone mineral density. And then that long-term stress is associated with low bone density and weaker bones, and then a higher fracture risk. You may go, well, okay, I fall and I fracture. What's the big deal? No, you can fall and fracture and not recover, right? This is the deal. Like if you're younger, fine, you'll probably recover pretty well. But the older you get, then the more devastating it is, the higher risk for early death or mortality. Like we'll all die one day. We just don't want to die early. So stress associated with the weaker bones. And then of course, the frailty and the fracture risk. It doesn't necessarily frailty, sorry, the fracture risk. So I want you to keep in mind, you may go, well, I don't have that much stress. And many times we don't notice the stress because we're so accustomed to it. And these are some of the everyday sources of stress. Now, the first one is really important because we really cover this a lot in gerontology, is caregiving. Very often women in this phase of life are caregivers. You have aging parents. Hopefully they're healthy and doing well and independent. But if they're not, you got to take care of them. And you may also have older children at home and still kind of taking care of them and worried about them. Or maybe you have a handicapped child and this is a stressor for life. And maybe you have, you're caring for someone who's sick. It's hard to be a caregiver. So it is a very important job, but you have to have respite. You need some stress relief as well. So that's a big one. And this is why we call women in this generation the sandwich generation, because we're sandwiched in between aging parents and children still who may be at home. And then we have jobs that we don't like and difficulties there. We have financial problems. Maybe money's difficult to make. Maybe it's going out the door too fast and you're stressed about this and you can't stop thinking about it. And we have relationship problems. Those toxic relationships have got to go or be managed somehow. But this is a chronic elevated stress, chronic cortisol, chronic inflammation that you don't necessarily even feel all the time. Also, unresolved trauma. This is something that needs to be taken care of as well. We always like to push these things under the rug. They're horrible. We don't want to look at them. We don't want to deal with them, but we got to do it. And then we have also the overload of technology in our lives. And we have computers and phones and we just never stop. We may go, oh, I'm being entertained. But in fact, this is still having a negative effect on our body at times. So those are the stressors, but I also want to talk about a couple other stressors. One of them being thyroid, and I'll go through this very quickly because women in midlife, especially in my community, I see so many of us having thyroid issues. So thyroid is part of this whole stress web, and it also regulates metabolism, not just how fast you're burning your food, but how fast your bones are building up and breaking down. So if you have hyperthyroid, that overdrive thyroid, or if you're over medicating your thyroid, which can happen very often, this is kind of speeding things up in your body, and that's including bone turnover and loss. Unfortunately, not bone building, but the lost. So make sure that you look at your thyroid, you take care of your thyroid, and that's one of the major markers to look at. Now, the next ones are smoking and alcohol. Hopefully you're not doing this, but if you are, you're not alone. It's part of this stress piece because when you smoke, you're reducing the blood supply to the bone. This is not good. We need the bones to grow, and it can't do that. It's also a hormonal stressor. So you're producing less estrogen. There's more oxidative stress. You're building up bone much slower, and you are breaking it down faster than you're actually building it up. Alcohol, similar thing. It's toxic to the bone cells. It promotes bone cell death, which is a bummer because we need our bone cells to be alive. And it happens through oxidation and reactive oxygen species, or ROS. And just a quick recap on oxidation, it's that rusting that happens. Imagine you cut an apple in half, you see it turn brown. That's the oxidation. That's basically when cells sort of steal electrons from some of the nearby molecules and they destabilize them and then they cause damage. The reactive oxygen species, they're actually, your body makes a few of these during normal energy production, like in the mitochondria. So it's kind of a normal thing and they act as signals. But when there are too many of these, are more ROS is like an aggressive oxygen molecule that's got a little bit too much energy from some unpaired electrons nearby, and they just bully some of the other cells that are around them. They're not zombie cells, but they remind me a lot of zombie cells. They're just causing damage. And alcohol is a stressor, and it also cranks up the production of ROS. And then it just overwhelms our body, damages the proteins and the DNA in the bone cells. So we just don't need this. And alcohol, another interesting that it does, it pushes the marrow stem cells towards fat storage versus building bone cells. Okay, like, well, who wants that? And it increases the inflammation, and it's just no bueno. And even moderate intake, which is interesting. And I kind of looked up, I was like, in my head, I was thinking moderate is like once a week or something like that. You drink on the weekend or something. I'm not talking about binge drinking, but just to me, that seems moderate. Moderate is 1 drink a day. I was like, I am so out of it. But 1 drink a day, okay, let's call it moderate drinking. It's also shifting your body into bone breaking down faster than it's actually building up. So you want to control the alcohol intake. It's not good for your bones. It's not good for your hormones. It's not good for detoxification. It's not good for your liver. It's just one of those things you really should try to manage. And the last couple of things I want to talk about in terms of stress is the social stress, emotional load, and loneliness. Now, loneliness is like smoking 15 cigarettes a day in terms of what the damage it does on your body. It's actually really surprising. Loneliness it kills, and it also causes a lot of chronic stress and chronic inflammation, and that's no good for your bones. Who would have thought loneliness is bad for your bones? But it is. And this emotional strain that we have from all these things that are happening in our lives, it goes down the same stress pathways as all the other things. It's cortisol, sleep disruption, inflammation, all this stuff. And then we have, if you're lonely or emotionally detached or just isolated and just not going out in the world, then this also decreases your motivation to take care of yourself. Like, you're not going to be likely jumping into the gym and making a healthy breakfast or even caring about your sleep. So it just kind of spirals out of control. So we really need to take care of ourselves in that way. And now I want to talk about the sleep. So we talked about the stress part and the sleep. And sleep and stress go hand in hand. You cannot sleep if you're stressed out. And sleep is where the repair happens, especially deep sleep. Bones can build. Growth hormone is released. It's released mostly when we're asleep and mostly during that deep sleep. Tissue can repair. This is why we call it beauty sleep. You obviously look better because your cells have been turning over and your face better. Lots of things happen when you're asleep, and bone remodeling is supported. And one interesting thing I learned about is melatonin, and that also is really important for your bones. I was like, oh my gosh, well, I had no idea. But when you have sufficient melatonin, this is stimulating that osteoblast formation, the building of the bones. And it's because it's moving these mesenchymal stem cells. These are stem cells that haven't decided, like, what's it going to be? It moves them from becoming fat cells into bone forming cells. Is that like too cool or what? Okay. So we need our melatonin. And when you don't have your melatonin and you're getting poor sleep, that's associated with lower bone mineral density, and you have more bone breakdown because you have less melatonin. And then you tend to have higher inflammation. You tend to have more disrupted hormones. The balance is off. And another interesting thing about sleep, and you should really pay attention to, is sleep apnea. This is because all throughout the night, you're having these drops in your oxygen levels in your blood. And this triggers a stress response. You go into this fight or flight mode, the sympathetic mode. And then this brings a surge in those stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, and this can increase your blood pressure, and that signals the cells to break down the bones and then dials down the bone building signals. So who would have thought sleep apnea in bones? But yes, there is a whole trail out there. And one thing that was really interesting, I learned from Mollie Eastman. She's one of my go-to sleep experts. She's got a great podcast called Sleep is a Skill. Go check that out. And I learned from her a long time ago that sleep apnea is not just overweight people. I thought I had this image of an overweight man having sleep apnea. And she said, no, there's a lot of research now showing lean women as well have a lot of sleep apnea. So I will, if I can remember to put that link to that episode that I had with her in the show notes, because she gives loads of great tips on how to test yourself for sleep apnea, because you're asleep. How are you going to know? And so generally, this lack of sleep, over time, it creates this chronic inflammation. Remember what I said about inflammation, and that's can lead to more bone breakdown. Even short-term sleep deprivation can negatively impact our bone turnover markers. So we really want to pay attention to that. So if you're sleeping poorly, your body's just not getting these signals to go and repair and rebuild and rejuvenate. Sleep is such a magic bullet. Like, my favorite things are sleep and exercise. Like, there's two magic bullets right there. So what happens when we're in midlife? This is what I'm seeing in our community of women. Now, there's all kinds of people out there, but the ones I seem to attract is the woman who's exercising a lot and eating too little. And that is a major stress on the body. How in the world are you supposed to build bone with, you have the signal to build it, but it's not able to get the nutrients it needs because you're not eating enough or not getting enough nutrients in there to actually build the bone. And then on top of that, we're all stressed out because we're in midlife. We've had 50 years or more or less of the bucket getting overloaded. It's been filling up our stress bucket. And then, of course, it overloads by the time we get to midlife. So it doesn't have to, but it will if you don't take care of your stress. And of course, we're sleeping less because we're so stressed out. And sometimes we're biohacking a little too hard. You know, we're doing the cold plunging and we're fasting and we're over supplementing. And some of us are over medicating or managing our own medication, which probably shouldn't. So you really need to work on some of these things. And this combination can raise our cortisol. We can't recover. There's too much inflammation, and all of this affects our bone building process. You just can't outtrain chronic stress, and you can't build bone when you're in a constant state of deprivation. So I'm going to give you some strategies now. I'm going to wrap up here. So I want, in terms of sleep, let's talk basic sleep stuff. And I know there's so many cool gadgets and supplements, and I've got so many episodes on all this stuff, but they don't work, and they don't work as well if you don't have some of these foundations in place. So one thing I hear over and over again is get consistent sleep. Get your wake and sleep time the same, more or less. Mollie Eastman, my sleep expert girlfriend, she says every single sleep conference she goes to, they all stress that this is such a big lever. And within an hour or two shouldn't be a problem, but generally on the weekends and during the week, you want to have the same time you go to bed and same time you wake up. And you want to get somewhere between 7 and 9 hours of sleep, not 7 and 9 hours in bed. We want sleep there. So I always say, aim for 9 hours. Aim to get 9 hours of sleep. You're probably going to get 8, maybe 7. But if you aim for 7, you're probably going to get 6, or maybe even less. The other thing you want to do is support your circadian rhythm. What does that mean? That means you want to get the signals in your body to know when it's daytime and when it's nighttime. So you get your melatonin right, your cortisol right. And so that means try to get outdoors first thing in the morning, within an hour of waking up if you can, even if it's just stepping outside with your coffee. I know it's maybe freezing it sometimes, but get as close as you can to a window if you're in a high rise and you can't. Really try to get a little bit of time outdoors, like 15 minutes at least. Okay. If you can go walk a dog, even better. And then try to get a couple more times, just 15-minute bursts throughout the day. So if you can take your lunch outside, if you can watch a sunset, fabulous. Just try to set your timer for that. And the next thing is to dim the lights once the sun goes down. Don't have bright lights in your home. Try not to look at your screens. And if you must look at TV or computer or telephone, wear those blue blocking glasses. Alcohol and caffeine, try to time them right, obviously, or get them out of your life if they really disrupt you. They're such a sleep disruptor. But I know a lot of people say, I can sleep fine if I get my caffeine before noon or whatever it is. And the next thing would be the bedroom. Keep it cool, around 65 degrees Fahrenheit or about 18 degrees Celsius. I know it sounds chilly. It should be a little chilly, and then you get under the covers and then you're good. It should be dark. It should be quiet. And if you're like me, you can put on like some Spotify tunes and spa sounds, put some lavender smell or incense or something like that in your room. And this sends signals to your body like, oh, it's time to wind down. And try to get 1 or 2 good bedtime routines down, like a little ritual, whether it's journaling or breath work, a little stretching. That really helps. And that kind of leads me into the stress regulation piece. Now here, try to take some of these tips. My favorite tip for managing stress is breathing, breath work. Go to YouTube, find breath work for sleep or breath work for stress. You're going to find a million one ways to do it. But one of my favorite ways to do it is inhale for 4, a count of 4, 3, 2, 1. Exhale for 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Inhale 4, exhale 6. You can do 5, 8, 6, 10. Doesn't matter as long as the exhale is a little longer than the inhale. And that's because that activates the parasympathetic nervous system, that longer exhale. Walking Outdoors is another great stress buster. If you can forest bathe, that means just going out into nature, be mindful. Don't be listening to a podcast or something when you're walking around. Just be mindful of the nature and the environment around you. Meditation, yoga, stretching, prayer. These are all fabulous things to do just before bed or any time of day to manage your stress. Even if it's 5 minutes, I promise you, that's all you need to start feeling better. Social connections. These aren't huge stress busters. Positive social connections, right? We want to remove the toxic people from our life, but we want to keep the people in our life who make us feel safe, who make us feel supported. These are really good people, and we need to nurture our network in that way. And then remove the toxicities, whether that's toxic food, toxic environment, you're lonely, mold, heavy metals, toxic relationships, plastics, pesticides, alcohol, medication. I mean, not to stop your medication, but just try to work with your doctor and lowering it if you can. So all of these things are very disruptive for our stress and our body in itself, and then ultimately our bones. And if you must get professional support and therapy, there's so many things you can do out there. You need to have some serious conversations, maybe at home or at work, maybe it could be life-changing. And also one thing that we get pretty good at menopause is building boundaries and saying no. That's one of the pluses of menopause that nobody really talks about. And then the last part is to recover. We want to recover strong, recover well. Don't do those intense workouts every single day like you used to in your 20s and 30s. Don't overfast. Make sure you rest, you recover. You may need a few more days than you used to, and that's okay. And make sure you eat enough, get enough food, get enough nutrition, get enough calories. So we really want to shift our nervous system from this like go, go, go hamster wheel kind of thing to just chill, right? We need to recover. We need to repair. We want to let go. We just got to stop. Sometimes even all the biohacking stuff, just stop it. Just let it go and reset. So just a reminder that rest, sometimes we get into this mode like rest is, oh, that's for lazy people. No, you got to rest strong. Rest is when that adaptation happens. Rest is when the muscles build and the bones build, right? We don't want to focus on just pushing harder and eating less. And, you could be accelerating the bone loss more than you think. So recovery is one of the best strategies. If you're already lifting weights, you're eating your protein, you're doing all the right things. Okay, I'm getting all my nutrients. I'm getting enough calories and even getting the hormones. Then if you're doing this and you're not seeing the results you want to see, then really sleep and stress could be the amplifiers that really decide how much of the benefits that you're actually getting from all those practices that you're doing. So don't ignore that. Bone health is not just one thing. It's not just calcium or lifting weights or getting your hormones. It's a whole system. And movement is great. It loads the bones and the skeleton. Nutrition gives us the building blocks so we can feed those bones and make them grow. Hormones regulate the process and helps ease us into bone building. And then sleep and the stress really determine whether we're actually rebuilding, right? So don't ignore your recovery. You're really going to limit yourself. So one little call to action is try to choose one sleep habit. Choose one maybe that I talked about or any other one, and choose one stress busting practice that you can experiment with this week. Start today. So this really wraps up our 5-part bone health series. I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't listened to the earlier episodes and you're curious about them, just go back, start from episode 1 and then jump into the ones that you need the most. All of them are really great and they're all in the show notes. And download the mini bone guide in the show notes as well. And you're going to get some real practical steps on what to do next. Mini, like it's not overwhelming. And if you really want more personalized support in implementing all of this, consider joining us in the Biohacking Menopause membership group. This is where we take some of this theory into actual practice. We have challenges and hold you accountable and make sure you check in or just give you the information that you need in a step-by-step process. So please consider joining that. I'll have a link to that in the show notes as well. So thanks so much for listening. I appreciate you. I wouldn't be here without you. I'm so glad you made it to the end, and I'll see you next time. So have a good day, good night, good morning, wherever you're at.